So our next speaker is, is also in the digital storytelling world. And as you all know, storytelling has been the root of human interactions. This is how we learn, this is how we engage, this is how we get to know other people. And our next speaker is an award-winning technology entrepreneur. She's a game producer with almost 20 years experience in the industry. And with her company, Storybyte Studio, she focuses on interactive and digital storytelling with purpose. I'm really excited to hear what that is all about. Please welcome Rosie Luckhurst.
Thanks, everybody. It's really exciting to be here, and I've already heard quite a few stories today, so that's really been good. So she's already introduced me, so I will only just say my company is quite a small company, but I work with really interesting companies in sort of a partnership, because things like the Metaverse, as David was also saying, it's a huge area. We don't know where it's going yet. We don't know what is happening in it yet, and therefore it's quite interesting to partner up with people that you may not have thought about. So let me start off with a story. So there once was a god in Southeast Australia. And apparently that god had teeth made out of lava, and the lava spit from his mouth, and that turned the lava into land. And that land is now still inhabited, and thousands of years later, people live there. Now, how do we know this story? How do we know that this story is true? This has been passed on from generation to generation to generation, and there's a hill that actually exists that has this name, that bears this name. And that hill was looked at. DNA samples were taken of things that they found. They also looked at, geological findings. And it seemed that hill actually used to be a volcano. And the last time it erupted was 37,000 years ago. Meaning, that's a very old story. And that's one of the reasons why we tell stories, to pass on things to people that come after us, right? That's how it started. But just like our worlds evolve, also storytelling evolved. We may have started around the fireplace telling each other stories to teach each other things, to pass on knowledge, for example. Then it became about learning. It became about, getting better at certain things. It became about evolving yourself. And then also it became about what you can do in worlds that don't exist, right? From TV to books to, as you can see here, gaming, for example, or even, finally, then also in the Metaverse. And so I'm going to give you a few examples today of projects that were out there. Not all of them are mine, but in the end, I'll also talk about a few of the ones that I've worked on. But let's start with one that everybody knows. Who knows this story? Really? Anybody heard of Stranger Things? See, this is how stories evolve. So it was first called Montauk when the people who wrote it actually pitched it. And they pitched it as a limited series, 8 episodes, and then never again. Nothing after that will ever happen. And who knows it, right? Obviously, we're now in season 5 has already been bought now. And not only that, it actually merged to different mediums. After this, they started making books about it. There's game cards around. And all of those use the story of Stranger Things. And now there's even experience parks, like in New York, in Atlanta, and LA, and San Francisco, and other places, where you can go through stories in sort of a escape room kind of feeling meets, let's say, horror story, if you will. And it's a 3D experience, so you also follow storylines to be able to go out. And therefore, it's become a whole different type of story, right? But still the same storyline. Now, here's an easier one to identify, right? Marvel's been doing this since 1932. Where they started out with comics, but then turned into books, and then turned into game cards, and turned into movies and TV shows. And there's so many stories that are told within the Marvel universe years and years and years later. I mean, we still have, 5 or 6, I think, per year coming out of different stories in that same universe, all springing from the books that were made in the 1930s. And so a lot of people do this really quite well, where they take a story from one medium to another. But I also want to touch a little bit on, it doesn't really have to be a humongous thing, right? And every medium has nice things that you can work with, and sometimes stories work in one place, but they don't really work in another. Who's ever had the experience of reading a book and then going to the movie and being really disappointed?
Yeah.
Has anybody ever had the other way around? Right, see? That's because it's not the same medium, right? Those stories were oftentimes not meant to be told in that area. And we see this now not only from books to movies, but we also see it from things like games to movies, right? There used to be movies, there used to be games that turned into movies. Now there's movies that turn into games, so it goes both ways. And it's really important to look at what works for which medium. So we're going to look at a couple of small examples. So this is a company, just as a disclaimer, a company I'm involved in. And what they do is they create VR experiences from movies, but also they create their own VR and AR experience. They, similar to what we heard before, they started out with wanting to educate people and really tell stories to help children learn again how reading can be fun. So they started with books that then turned into AR experiences with books that could then also, with cheap glasses, be looked at in a VR world. And so the story would hop between mediums, right? That's the first thing that they started with. And then they found, well, it's really hard to sell this. They were starting to approach like Walmarts and Kmarts and saying, this is really, really cool stuff. And they even had really good successes at the beginning, selling hundreds of thousands of copies. But it's still, it's an educational project, and it's an educational product, and that seemed a little bit tricky. And then also there was the story that then, what else could you do with it? Because that's always what people ask. What else can you do with that same story? And that was a little bit limited because it was educational. So then they started creating experiences around different brands like Hotel Transylvania, or the Transformers, or one of the newest one is Boss Babies. And they took the content from those movies, turned those into experiences, first in AR and VR, then they built kind of a metaverse world around it, where you can actually play out scenarios from the movies. So bringing it back to stories, it then turned into more than just making an AR character or a little world, but they also gave you a storyline within that you could follow that was in addition to the movies. And hopefully the next couple are already lined up. It doesn't always have to be such a big thing. I mean, Netflix is experiencing with gaming. Netflix is experiencing with interactive movies, as you can see on the left-hand side. You can make basic choices. This is something that's existed for a while as well, and it's a cool technology. It's the interesting part about storytelling there is if the users choose where the story goes, it becomes like a script that kind of goes this way, right? So it's quite interesting to write those kinds of stories. And it's simple. It's quite simple because the choices are usually not very complicated, right? In this case, for example, do you want Frosties or Kellogg's? And at some point, you'll figure out if he'd taken the other box, this is what would have happened. But it's not a huge decision. So there's limitations to those kind of interactive things. It's usually yes or no questions. And then the story itself also doesn't have to always be interactive. It can also be very simple. So Dove, for example, had this nice storyline around the reverse selfie, where they really created a large impact with somebody taking a picture and then, or actually putting a selfie up, right? But then they reversed it. And so you saw kind of what this woman looked like on Instagram, and then bit by bit, she got stripped away to just a teenage girl that was very lonely and scared. And so it doesn't have to be very complicated. One of my favorite fun projects to do, if I can, is the Telelibrary. So if you guys can, try it out. And I say if you can because usually the spots are booked out within probably 3 minutes after you get the mail that there's new slots open. But this is just telephone. So you sit and you're being called by an AI. You're being asked even to give it a name. I gave it the name Paul, and I've stuck with Paul a couple of times. I've been able to do it, don't know why. But Paul then actually guides you through a storyline. And as you evolve with that story, you also are able to make certain choices that gives you playback across things like Paul will ask you, would you like to see something? Would you like to hear something? Would you like me to send you something? And This can be things like other people that have told their story. Now, at the beginning, you think it's kind of fun, and then he starts with, right, so this was your session. Do you want to continue? Okay, so you need credits. How do you get credits? You get credits by telling your story. So Paul will start asking you questions, and you start telling the stories. And those stories actually become part of the telelibrary and become part of what other people can see as stories. So that's another medium where you can do interactive storytelling without actually telling the story, because it's really just an AI that asks you questions, right? And then this is on the left-hand side or on your right, is a New York Times project that was quite acclaimed in the time, and it told the story of an avalanche. But it used not only the internet, it also used media, it used videos, interactive clicking maps. And so also there, it was quite simple, but the story was profound enough that you wanted to know more, and therefore that's what got people in, and that's what got people to stay. Everything we do now in storytelling is moving towards being more interactive. And one of the projects that I like also to highlight is this is a movie that's completely made on Instagram. It's filmed on, in fact, the company does nothing but that. They film everything on an iPhone. They still have 35 production people and cameramen and makeup and everything, but they film it on an iPhone. And this is the story of Eva, which is kind of similar to Anne Frank's story. And they put the premise out there and said, what if Eva, who died in the Holocaust, actually had Instagram? How would that then have played out? And so Eva is telling her own story, just as if she was filming herself, you know, selfies, obviously. And then they released this movie in 15-second increments over a period of 48 hours. And they got 300 million views with a movie shot on an iPhone. And the reason I bring this up is the creativity is not just about the story, it is about figuring out what works for that medium. So they looked at Instagram, what works there? Probably nobody's going to watch a 1.5-hour movie about a Holocaust. But if you chop it up, and if you make it more interactive, and people can comment on it, for example, right? Maybe then that works on Instagram. So you always have to think about the medium that you're doing it for. Gaming's been very good at that. They really looked at interaction. Storytelling there is a little bit like jigsaw puzzling. You never know what the user is going to do, where they're going to walk, so you have to make sure that the important parts of the story are actually really embedded enough so that people understand what the story is about, but they still have agency. And these are a couple of examples. I'm not going to go through each of every one, but these are a couple of good examples where they use that for a better impact, not for just entertainment, but Concrete Genie, for example, is about bullying, to really teach people about how bad that is and what kind of impact that has. And it's, apart from having a beautiful world, the storyline is actually really well done. And so each of these games are made for entertainment, but we're starting to see that even in the gaming world, a lot of them have more of a purpose and really want to create some impact with their stories. So we'll come to one of my projects. Here's a project that I worked on for a couple of years for a nonprofit organization. So there's no ads, nothing in the game. That was very important. We didn't sell it. It's because it's a nonprofit. It's still available for free in a couple of languages. The premise of this was that there was a woman who had a book, a self-help book for kids, and she wanted to digitize that. And I immediately thought, okay, this could be a really, really cool game. We just didn't know how to do it. So how do you take kids that have chronic illnesses, that have depression, anxiety, and how do you give them a self-help medium where they can learn skills to become better? And how do you do it entertaining enough that they keep coming back for it? And this is, again, where storytelling comes in. If you make it interesting, of course, there's game mechanics, there's, you know, reward systems and points, but also the storyline should be interesting to follow. It should be evoking empathy, for example, with some of the characters in there. So this is a story of Shadow's Edge, which is a city that's been hit by a storm, much like when these kids get cancer or Lyme disease or anything like that. And in the city, your task as the player that comes in is to help the character that was stuck find the families back and bring the families back to the city. Because after the storm, everybody left and the character was stuck in the elevator, and you have to help that character. And you do that by doing certain psychological things that will help you become more mentally resilient and have more of a positive attitude. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, in the game, things like journaling, answering prompted questions, much like you would have on websites or with self-help books, and art, as you can see here. So part of also becoming better is venting, right? And talking to people about your situation. And so we've created this so that the kids in the game can actually create their own arts, and they get prompts for it to make it easier. And then they can share that with other people in the game. We've had over 100,000 downloads. I know that doesn't seem like very much, but it is a digital therapeutic. And we've done a couple of clinical trials, or we haven't, obviously, because we're not allowed to. But Laurie's Children's Hospital has done a clinical trial with cancer patients, and they found out that people after this have more of a positive outlook on life. They understand better what having gone through the experience will actually do for them going forward. And they feel a little bit stronger. And they also feel less alone having played the game. So those are some really, really cool results. So this is just ending up at the sort of the things that I do now. From that, of course, what's your next project, right? We do a lot of small projects with smaller companies, but we also do projects for huge companies. So here's a bit of my story. When I was about 7, I started telling my own bedtime stories. So I should have known by then that storytelling would have been important in my life, but I never really did. Instead, I went into classic tech. I went from help desk to programming to project management, then to sales, and all those kind of things. Until about 12 years ago, a company asked me to play SimCity in real life. And what that meant was we took urban planning from real cities, we virtualized this in kind of a Metaverse, and then we did that with actual planning, with actual bolts and nuts. So we worked with developers, we worked with Philips, Cisco, IBM, and all those people to bring the technology in early. And then we played the scenario. We brought in 68,000 different characters that could exist in the real world, looked at, how would they drive? And if 25,000 people drove the wrong way at a roundabout, then obviously there's something wrong with the planning and not with the avatars. Right? So that's the kind of stuff that we did. And it kind of got me hooked on what's possible in virtual worlds. So currently, I talked to David about this, currently we with our small company, we look at brands, how they can use storytelling in these new virtual worlds. What are the technologies that work for them? Is it NFTs? Is it a combination of different ones? Is it gamified applications? Is it game mechanics? Or is it full-on gaming? Or is it just an environment and people want to sit and see a story? How can we make sure that that step that was mentioned before, that you don't just have people running around in a new universe, but what's the impact of that? How can we really make that mean something for the companies? Could we, for example, train people for disaster relief in a virtual world without having to first have a disaster to then be able to train them? And so those kind of things is what my company does and what we're interested in. And yes, we are also hiring. So just in case, look me up on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to have a chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks. We also have a little gift for you in the real world.
LinkedIn.
Ah, LinkedIn.
Just in case you want my LinkedIn.
Yes, and we also have a real life present for you. I know that you still have a very important appointment today. She's pitching today still, so please wish her good luck as well for tonight. And
thanks.